Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Dow, President of the Hardwick Historical Society. Thank you for coming. You may recall that in the spring we had booked a guest speaker to talk about his book, Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn. And at the last minute, he could not make it in person, so we did it virtually down at the Memorial Building. But then I discovered a second book called How Working Class Houses Became Modern, and read it and said, oh, this is about Hardwick. And so I invited Tom to come back to Hardwick, and this time he actually could make it in person. Tom's training as an architect are from Carnegie Mellon Institute and the University of Oregon, and he is Professor Emeritus from the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. Am I right? And it does these fascinating books about why the houses we live in and the buildings that we work in look the way they do. So I will turn it over to Thomas Hupke.
Sorry to have missed the last lecture, but I had to work on my ticker here, so now I'm here. It's going to be okay. I had a great tour of your town today. Wiz showed me around, studied your town in terms of its geography and all of that. But, seen it. Last book, Big House, Little House. I have 50 years of driving through New England and looking at your houses and things like that and trying to discover them. So I'll try to make reference in this talk to Hardwick, and if I stumble, I'll ask Wiz to correct me and all that. So, I have a great public library with the addition that you're making. Richardsonian fan, H.H. Richardson. It's based on a library, a couple of them, but Crane Memorial Library in Quincy, Massachusetts. It's a small version of that, but you have just a great library. Some people have kids, but I have books, and this is Junior. Junior is pretty good, and I'm glad to say it all. That's what authors do anyway. So it's a book about, and what I'm going to talk to you tonight about how, for the majority of Americans, housing improved over a period of time, and it quickened in a certain period of time in the early 20th century. It's not an improvement for everyone, but it's, I use the word middle class majority in some ways, or housing majority, meaning over 50% of the people get washing machines or something like that. And you'll hear it talk about that. So here are 20th century improved houses for a majority of Americans. So if you squint at that, maybe some of them might be unfamiliar to you and all that. If somebody goes thinking about modern housing or something, I'm saying these are the houses I'm talking about nationally. Okay, so I picked houses that if you went across the country, you're going to see this. And the way that they're all linked together is that they all have bathrooms. And they all have electricity, and they all have modern improvements, and they were the first really generation of those houses that did. Today, we all accept those kinds of things usually for most Americans, but here people were acquiring that. And I just want to show you the variety of houses. So if they're not familiar to you and all that, that's just other parts of the country. They had other kinds of houses. So. Next. It's a fairly simple story I'm telling you. It's about on the left are houses that are unimproved, so they don't have electricity, they don't have plumbing, and all that sort of thing. And at some point in the 20th century, in a 40-year period, new houses are built with these modern improvements, and older houses like this are improved. So it's a combination. But just to keep it straight, here are the older houses and here are the newer. Now, if you look at this, if you're not I studied houses for 50 years, so I can pick these off and all that. But if they look similar, there's not a lot of differences between them on the exterior. But on the interior, what goes on inside, there's some big differences. Those are the ones I'm going to talk about. But my hinge date is 1900. Before 1900, a vast majority of Americans, most of my relatives and most of yours, didn't have the improvements I'm talking about. After 1900, they started acquiring them. and most people do. The wealthy have had certain features since forever in some ways. So it's these houses changed to these houses over here, and I'll make references to Hardwick a little bit next. So if you look at the documentation, if you've listed, oh, that's exciting, I'll try to look at house history and books on that. Primarily when you look at house history, you'll find that we record larger houses, more the houses of the wealthy or larger. Queen Anne, I can give you names about houses that we usually look at. What's the street that was it we wrote down with the Victorian? Church Street, yes, West Street, Church Street. There's larger houses there. That's if you open most architectural books, you'll see the styles of architecture of those kinds of houses. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, I'm an architect, and this is a beautiful house. We call it Tudor, because you have half timbering in this, and the T word, you have Tudor there, and it's a beautiful house. But most houses like this, you can't name. You can call it vernacular, which is like saying it's the V word or something like that. It's everyday lifer house. It was undistinguished. I can distinguish that because there is a vocabulary. This is there's an early a bungalow plan in there of a certain kind of room arrangement. But anyway, just because I've looked at those hundreds and hundreds of houses like that. So my purpose today is to try to look at more average houses and talk about their improvement. And this might be the houses you live in, or anyway. It's common houses throughout America and a little bit in Hardwick after a while. If you looked at any of the books about housing, this is what you'll find historically. Some of the things, the books in the center here. Great books. America's literature of housing balloons after the Civil War. I mean, pattern books and Sears Roebuck's catalogs and things. Housing, it's a vast literature out there. But if you look at it, most of it is houses for larger houses, more elaborate houses. There are smaller house types and all that, but you have to be a little careful of those books because it's not going to give the story that I'm going to tell you today about most people's houses most of the time. And I think there's a way to think about that. I'm not saying this is not new on earth. No one's discovered this before. But again, if you look at the literature, I think this is what you'll find in the dominant literature, both of the 19th century and the literature that we have today, the current literature of just, cool houses that you look at. So a little bit of vocabulary. We've heard, and the code word here is middle class. And we all like to think we're middle class, right? It's like this, who isn't middle class? If you get a real rich person, they're middle class, and they call themselves anyway. So it's a plastic term that is out there, but it really means everyone in some ways. And if you read the literature, it's a sloppy way to talk about just everything in some ways. I'll give another word for that in just a second here, but as you go back in time, as you read the 19th century books and the interpretation of that 19th century, what you're going to find is middle class is really only a small percentage. When you say the middle class had bathrooms or something like that, it's only talking about like 10% of people, professionals and pharmacists and people with foremen in the sheds or something like that, people with a little bit more money. So you have to be careful of that word in all literature here. And here's now a working class, and this is what I'm saying is most people. This is the 19th century. This diagram will change because what will emerge is a much larger middle class. And it's that middle class, really of the majority culture, that starts to improve their housing. It's that story I'm talking about. So the word I use is middle majority. I'm a demographic historian. So when does a middle majority, and if you more than 50% of the people acquire plumbing, or water, conveyance and pipes or something like that? That's a very hard subject because it's, usually we got the first invention and all that, but getting the larger picture is a little more difficult. But that's what I'm after, this middle majority. What I'm not talking about is the 20% of Americans that live in houses that are, large and already have improvement, or a 20% minority in the bottom that really don't get improvement during the time I'm talking about. This is most minorities and Native Americans, blacks, and people without much income. So anyway, this is in the middle. That's what I'm talking about. So it's just a little rehash here. this is the unimproved houses, and this is improved houses. Remember, 1900s is that hinge date. So now I'm going to talk about houses in 1900, and before. What were those houses like? How was it like to live in houses? And think of your relatives. If you trace any guys back there to 1900, what did they have in their houses, and how did they live generally? That's what I'm trying to think about now. This is I think, one of my most important diagrams in that book, because what I'm saying there is that in 1900, there are 10 or 12 or whatever house types that most people live in most of the time. And so I don't know if you know, if you follow housing, ranch houses and four squares and different kinds of, we call them house types. Different floor plans is what you want to think about. Well, nationally, there were, in 1900, these are the dominant types which most people lived in. I would say about easily, these 8 houses would constitute, I think, probably about 50% of Americans lived in only these 8 houses. And the rest spread out into hundreds of other kinds of houses and everything. These are words that are not yet, some of you don't use. Now here's the I house. Geographers made that up. So apologies here to begin with. There's a kind of vocabulary about house types that is used academically and all that, or by contractors and real estate developers, that may not be your way of talking about a particular house. It doesn't matter. This means there's a specialty about that or something like that. But here are the dominant types, and I'm going to talk about just 3 of these right here. But the one I'm going to focus on a little bit more is this house. Side hall. Now, you may not call that this way, but you guys have probably more houses of side hall house than any other type in the village. Now, what this house is, if you think about it, there's a gable end here and there's a door in toward one side or the other. You've seen this hundreds of times. Now, throughout New England, this is New England's most popular house. You think the Cape Cod, I go along Cape Cod and Boston and all that, and looking at everywhere. This house dominates throughout New England in numbers. So find out how people live in this house. That's the kind of research I'm doing, and I continue to do that. But this, you've got, I'm guessing, but yeah, that I've seen just in here, you've got 50 of these in the village, maybe more, 60, 70 or something like that, houses of this type. So the tenements, you've heard of tenements in New York, anywhere that you have a small apartment house. You've got some, they were called tenements during the period, 2- and 3-story squarish kinds of buildings that you have tenement apartments. Early bungalow plan, before you had major bungalows, you had bungalows. Okay, so out there these are dominant houses that are out there, and in those houses people lived in a certain way. And it's, how did your grandparents or great-great-grandparents, or depending how old you are here, how did they live in those houses? That's what I'm up to right now. But first I'd like to just pick off 3 of these and just talk a little bit, because I think they have something to do with you guys. So here's your side hall. So this is just houses in Portland. I'm studying Portland, Maine. I've come from Portland, Oregon, but I'm studying Portland, Maine houses. And so these are in Portland, Maine. You see how the door is off to one side? When you open that door, what do you see? Staircase. Okay, this is universal. this happens all over Maine and all over Vermont, et cetera, on and on, hundreds and thousands of times there. So why did they build houses like this? Well, we're not going to answer all that question type, but this is your dominant house, and it was made over and over again, and in your village too. You have a big building spurt when you guys go electrical at your sheds. Cutting granite, and once you do that, you have these side halls coming in. What's the field down there?
Atkins Field.
Atkins Field. Around Atkins Field there, you got 20 houses that are these side halls built for people working in the sheds and other things. So it's a little, not the lowest economic workers there, but a kind of middle class of guys in the sheds and all that, families that were there, the side hall. Here's a house, the I house. We call it I house. You see how tall this is? It's 1 room deep. It's a very thin house. You have very few of these in town, but if you go to Tennessee and Kentucky or the upland south, there's thousands and thousands of it. It's one of the more popular houses in America before 1900, and it gets built after. Anyway, you got a few of these out there that are like this, that called the I Hall. You would call them Center Hall Colonial or something like that here. But anyway, you don't have many of those. I thought you'd have more, and that's why I put it here. Live and learn in Hardwick. Here's a house that you don't have too much of, but a worker's cottage. Now, any small house with a gable that is 1 story high and has a gable on top of it, and it looks like this or that one over there, could be called worker's cottage. It's a generic kind of term. I've done research in Chicago and Milwaukee where you really do have a house like that. It's a floor plan with small little rooms on one side, bigger rooms, living room and kitchen there on another. But you may or may not have some of those houses. Anyway, that's out there in big numbers nationally. This is a house of the working class in the urban areas where they have very, very small houses. The last one of these is called side gable house, or if you're in the Midwest, you call it temple and wing. Here's the temple. Think of a Greek temple, and then the wing out over here. Here's the kitchen in this wing facing the street. I've seen 4 of them in town so far. I think you have a couple more of these houses out there. Anyway, that's the kind of house types that's out there. Why am I doing this is I hope it rings a bell a little bit with some of the houses that you've known over there. All of these houses that I'm showing here are 3 or 4 rooms. Most people, on average, in 1900, 120 years ago, okay, lived in houses of 3 or 4 rooms max in some ways. Did you know that? So your relatives, if they're going back, now if they were rich and all that, they could have 6 rooms and they have a Victorian turret and all that, but that's not most of us. Okay, so 3 or 4 rooms, that's what you're having for the majority of these houses in America in 1900. But how did people live in those 3 or 4 rooms? Well, this is how they lived, okay? So the pictures are cool, and we'll talk about them in just a second, but here's the professor talking about the characteristics of how people lived. And so I can show you floor plans, and I could show you, foot patterns or things like that. But there's a couple ways to think about life in those houses that I've just shown you at 1900, 120 years ago, okay? So first is kitchen-centered living. What could that mean? That means that the kitchen is the center of the house, period. That's where life goes on. That's where everything occurs. That's where feeding the kids, and that's where sleeping is lots of time. These houses that are kitchen-centered, that's the only heat source, the kitchen stove. There's no parlor stove or the furnace in the basement or anything like that. That's way in the future and all of that. So that's why people gather around that. This is a very good photo here. We have photos over here from the New York tenements. Okay, we got billions of times that people ate in kitchens in working class houses in America, and we have about, I think, 3 pictures like this and this one over here. Anyway, we don't take pictures of how people ate in 1900. We do take other people's pictures, richer people's pictures, but not these. But anyway, kitchen-centered living. So here's a scene from a tenement in New York. So here's a stove. So it must be a kitchen, right? And here's plates. There's all the plates. And that's all their plates. It's like you got a closet over there or something like over there. But you see the bed over here behind the curtain? So you often find in working class scenes that you see authentic photos, a bed in every room. There's no separate room for bedrooms and a dining room, or it's all together for lots of reasons. If you study that, that's how people lived. That's what kitchen-centered usually means. So multi-functioning rooms, it's really saying the same thing. This operates, here's the bedroom, here's the kitchen, and they're doing piecework. Either for Lowell Mills or something, they're doing shoe leathers. Well, I don't know what you guys didn't have much industry that's sent to Lowell or all those manufacturing towns, but you have equivalents of that in some ways. Work. So work is done at home. It's done, this is before salaried labor for the husband. So there's contributions. That's always happening, and that's happening here. Next, lack of privacy. Gee whiz, 3 rooms and 5 kids. So we're not talking privacy by any kind of standard of Americans or something like that. There is no privacy for the working class that way. That you can't write your novel or something like that in the back room because you have peace or whatever it is. So there's a crowdedness, and that occurs. Minimal utilities. And that's why you say that is there's no bathroom. The bathroom is down the hall and down the stairs and out in the backyard and all that, outhouses, ubiquitous. Minimal furnishings. If you see the amount of furnishings and people, it's minimal. There's no Kmart. There's no, anyway, it's surprisingly little bedding and a couple kitchen chairs and things like that. Minimal furniture. Residential impermanence. If you follow the history of housing in America, don't you feel some novels or the Ye Old Kentucky Home, where 8 generations of the McDonald family lived, and isn't that cool? Working class doesn't have generations of same family in the same house. You got to move on. Death occurs, and families are blown apart, and there's lots of reasons why you don't stay in the same house for long periods of time if you're average, and certainly down the food chain in the working class. So you're moving on, and you don't have the residential traction that you have in other things. Additional family members and borders. A history of borders is very interesting. I'm studying immigrant groups in Portland, Maine, and I'm studying the Irish. They come over in big numbers, single women, and they have to stay in every other kinds of house and all that as borders. And borders are out there in big numbers, and usually in family history it gets kind of airbrushed because we don't like to say we took in people and because we didn't have enough money. Anyway, it's out there, but it's very difficult to see. Even in census, it disappears out there, but it's out there in big number. This is a rare photo, but what it shows here is a converted living room. And here are the borders that block the windows because they're working on the night shift. There's no other photos like this in America, okay? It's rare because you don't have photos of borders because you don't take pictures of borders because they come and go and all that. Many houses, you rent out the best room for your highest border. So the parlor would be rented out to a high pay. It sounds unusual to us, but that happened over and over. Those are the kind of histories I try to trace. So that's the living conditions that occurred in those houses in 1900. 120 years ago, that's average, okay? And so, it's not everyone, but it's a big middle that happens that way. The story you usually, I know, just picking on one room system over here, so eating, okay? How do Americans eat in 1900? Well, we have thousands of photos that show this photo. There's a Victorian dining room, the candles are lit, you got it? Okay, and the servant comes in and puts it down. Haven't you seen films and that it's over and over and we got a lot of pictures about that. We got 2 pictures or something like, or 3 maybe that are like this. Here's a working class family, they say they're Italians in the research. Here's the stove, okay? And the stove is put over a fireplace and all that, so you max up the fireplace, you block it, and then you put the stove over there, and they're eating in the kitchen, as the majority of Americans did. And then in the 20th century, they gradually get dining rooms, whether they're used or not, or something like that. But anyway, you can contrast these.
May I interrupt and say that in 1900, 60% of the houses in the village of Hardwick had a border or a laundry in it.
Excellent, good. Did you know that? I know they're high numbers because I've studied other cities. Thank you. And that's why I could say this. I don't know your town, but I know that there were a lot. So 60%?
60%.
Do you know how many that is? That's a majority, and all of that. Had people who weren't part of the nuclear family, or whatever you want to call that, who were there paying rent. Now, it could be a Polish family my family, the Hupkas and all that. They come from Poland, the single young kid and lives with a Polish family. So that's classic. Another one is the Irish maid that comes in that has the attic apartment or something like that lives in the attic and serves dinner, or like the one that you see over there. It's out there. Wow. I knew it was high, but I didn't know it was that high. By the way, you've got a great historian here. Wizzy we've gone back and forth about your utilities. We'll get to that at the end of that. You're gonna get some more. We'll put her on the spot and do more here. We've been talking about these houses before improvement in 1900. That's what I was just talking about. Now, let's talk about improved houses. From those conditions, most Americans, majority, improve their lives from what I was just telling you. So, well, this is a little repeat, but anyway, in these houses, and they look a little higgly-piggly. I mean, odd or whatever it is. There are big ones, there are small ones, there are doubles, duplexes, and there's single houses and all that. But America gets improvement, of domestic improvement, in a whole squadron of houses like this. And next. But I'm going to concentrate first off on one of them. So the improvement that is going on happens in all the houses I've just shown you. But just for focus today, I'm going to focus on one house for 5 or 10 minutes now, and that's this one over here. The word we use is bungalow. Ever heard that word? Most of you have heard the word bungalow. It comes from Bengali, Asian India, okay? It means the Brits that conquer India, and they take native houses and they were called bungalows, and they take the term. It goes to England, it becomes recreation houses on the seashore in Britain, and then it pops over to America lands on the house of most improvement in America. It kind of means in America an outdoor house, a house that has porches on it that it's a California kind of idea that cooks out there. But anyway, you don't have too many bungalows here in New England because they weren't building too many houses during the bungalow period. Well, you got a lot of building in 1900, but you didn't choose bungalows. You got to tell me why, Wiz. We're not clear about that one and all that. But okay, we'll get to that one. But in America, this house dominates in some ways the improvement period. The word bungalow. You'll see this now coming up. So here is a bungalow. It's a Sears, maybe I think it's a Sears Stanhope bungalow. We'll get to the why Sears has to do with that. But here's the bungalow plan. Now I can talk about style. I'm a certified architectural historian. I can tell you the Greek Revival from the Queen Anne, and you'll love it and all that. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about floor plan and how a building works for the people who are in it. So this is how it looks, but this is how it acts. So this is a classic a small bungalow where you have, and if you have your Catholics area, it's 3, okay? You've got the 3 major rooms: living room, dining room, kitchen. Holy Trinity! It's, there it is. And have you ever seen houses like this? You walk in that front living room, and you proceed to the dining room, and then you open the door and you get to the kitchen. Bungalow floor plan. The bedrooms are on the other side of the house. Really, it's 3 if you want: bedroom, bath, bedroom. It's kind of classic arrangement of American working class improvement. Inside that bungalow, this is Star Wars. This is like going to the moon and living there. And we don't think about that too much, but here's a bathroom, okay? And this, it's another 3, it's a Catholic lecture here that I'm giving you over here. 3 holy objects over here: the sink, the toilet, and the tub. 3-part system. That is universal. And I tell my architecture students, you think you're changing everything. Well, the bathroom hasn't changed for 120 years, for crying out loud. It's the same thing, for you. And that's okay, because we've reached a certain level of utilities coming together to solve problems that nobody had solved for ever since Adam and Eve. Sanitation and cleanliness and all the things. Interestingly, a working class family entering this bathroom would have touched things that they had never touched before: ceramic tile, chrome, stainless steel, tile. This is Oz. This is some universe, because nothing in their previous house had anything to do with those materials. Okay, and the previous houses were pretty grim, if you want to think about that way. They're kind of uniform, and there's wood and there's plaster on the wall and all that, but not a lot else happens there. Here's the bathroom. Bathroom is one of the major elements of domestic reform. But this is a list that I think is most important, just to think about what happens in the 20th century when people improve. So other people can make a list, and they'll be slightly different. Modern utilities. By any standard, that's the most important improvement that happens mostly in the 20th century, although interesting, Hardwick takes off on some of these a little earlier than other communities. You're so advanced in some ways. But there's 5 utilities you want to think about, and they're kind of in order of how you get them, but not necessarily in Hardwick. You got water, sewage, electricity, gas, and telephone. Telephone is the least important, but anyway, there's 5. Block. That happens to houses between 1900 to 1940 for a vast majority of Americans. This is revolution. There's no country that was even close to us. Even like Germany and England are the two competitors, but nothing close to the way that American modernizes its domestic conditions. So three fixture bathroom, I just said. Kitchen appliances. The ice house, the ice box turns to the refrigerator. Washing machines and stoves that are they can do vast things on. Sinks with our porcelain, linoleum on the floor, and all that. Vast changes in the way that they're operated. Dining rooms become more fashionable, whether or not they're used or something like that. Private bedrooms. They had bedrooms, and people slept, but it was all over the place. The idea of privacy. All of a sudden you got privacy. The working class never had privacy before, but these new houses with slightly more rooms, privacy develops. Generally, these houses get a little larger as we track working class into the 20th century, slightly larger American wealth increases. Closets. Closets are interesting and all that. But my students that get into houses that are early in this, where's the closets? There's no closets. There's nothing to put in closets, for crying out loud. I see. They didn't have a lot of things. Anyway, early houses don't have closets. Recreational porches. The bungalow has a porch. A couple other scholars, myself included, talk about the 8-hour day porch. That we now have a porch on the outside of the house that when we work 8-hour days, we have enough time to recreate on the front porch. Previously, 12-hour shift, recreate on the front porch. Okay, anyway, it's you can think about the front porch as being part of that, but not so important. Automobiles is part of the mix. That happens in America. The dynamic of the development of American manufacturing pushes out automobiles in a massive way, so that by 1930, 60-70% of Americans have some automobile or access to that. So it's part of this revolution too. There's also radio and vaccinations and all that, but that's other kinds of improvement. Interestingly, in the new houses, but not so much here in Hardwick, because you didn't go bungalow and all that. If you went into a bungalow, here's your bungalow expression of domestic life. There's 2 classics that vie with each other are the living room versus the kitchen and bathroom. Now, the living room develops a style of architecture. You can call it arts and crafts or bungalow or California. There's different ways of doing that. Stickly furniture or something that it's an historical style. It looks to old England or something like that. The working class before 1900 style. No, colonial revival, forget it. No, that they got plaster on the walls and all that, and so all of a sudden they have a living room that has an historical style. And if you open the door to the kitchen, there's another style, modernism, or modern materials or something like that wasn't trying to look ye old England or something like that. Anyway, there's houses develop style, and people accept that and live in slightly larger houses. Going down Bungalow Lane here, and again, this is designed for nationally and all that, so we'll quickly here. But here's the bungalow that is the most popular really in America, from Louisiana to Seattle to whatever. This is the bungalow house in the plan that I just showed you. Here is a house that you've also seen with a porch across the front, a big roof. It's slightly larger. It's a bungalow for more upscale, more family with more income bungalow. These houses are the same, but they look differently because this has all the bungalow detail, the large barge boards, usually the brackets. Here's, we can see the brackets over here. That's part of arts and crafts. Anyway, it has a style and it comes in. And again, in Hardwick, Wiz, I didn't see any. I didn't see bungalows here. Okay, you didn't build bungalows in that time, but you built in the bungalow period. Why you did that, we'll try to figure that one out, Wiz, because why did you not build bungalows, but you build the other thing? Okay, that's a good question. We'll solve it in a while. Here's the Chicago bungalow. I don't know if you've heard the term about that. It's different because they put a living room in the front and you bypass it and all that. So around the country, there's different bungalow types. If you can tell, I like bungalows, right? They're great houses in some way, because they represent improvement. That represent improvement for most people most of the time. So because I'm a professor, I'm going to give you all a quiz now. So here's the quiz question. I hope you have your pencils and you're going to be graded on a curve and all that sort of thing. Okay, so by placing the common bungalow in a national context. So what major characteristics of the bungalow do these popular houses from around the country all share? These are one-story bungalows, so you can see how different they are over there. But these are different over here. But why do they all share bungaloidness? That's a term if you get really hip on bungalows, you call them bungaloids. They all share the same bungalow floor plan. This is probably obvious. There's a porch out here and all that, but the same living room, dining room, kitchen goes on. But these, does that look like a bungalow? It's the floor plan of the bungalow. This is America's most popular duplex house. You've got, I've seen 15 of them. 10 of them in your town, okay? What it is one apartment over another. Your side hall house can instantly be converted into a two-family house. So it's, you could have, you say you have 100 or something like that here. So it's too much to get into. But some are built like this way, but it's two bungalow floor plans on top of each other. And you go to Boston, your three-deckers, any of you? Okay, it's three bungalow plans, one on top of the other. Okay, bungalow floor plan. It is the most popular floor plan before the ranch house in America. Happens all over, and it happens in very different kind of houses. I didn't think we were going to get so much of a bungalow zealotry here, but anyway, there is the bungalow. Okay, this is just this is the way I look at things. But here's the three rooms: living room, dining room, kitchen over here. Here's the bedroom and the bath in the middle, a little hallway over there. Okay, this is the dominant house type, and you have slightly another house type during this period, this side hall. For my architectural friends, I tell them this, and they get all kind of squirrely, because there's something that doesn't sit right over here. Modern domestic technology and its expression. Expressionism is a kind of idea about modernism and all of that. And so here's the Villa Savoy. This is by Le Corbusier, 1929. And let's say this bungalow was also built in 1929, maybe a couple of years earlier or something like that. So they're both built during the same year. Now, what would an architect say? What's the most modern? Well, yeah, it looks modern, but the utilities in these houses are both the same. It's the same kind of modern improvement in both of those houses, same water systems and all that. So my education is to make houses like this, to push the envelope or something like that anyway. But during this period, they are both modern domestically in some ways, even though this one looks a whole lot different than the one over here. If you're an architect or a professional, you can walk out right now or something like that, be kind of annoyed about something like that. So I'm trying to get under those people's skin. Now, you could say, Professor Hupko, I really like what you've said, and if you do, right? Let's pretend that you do and all that. And you could say, but I'd say, well, okay, I know you may like this, and you may want to try to go out there and read about it, but you got to be careful, because you're gonna run into stuff that doesn't say the same thing I did, and so I'm trying to armor you up now, because I'm saying that if you go out there with what I just said, the books that you read or something like that might tell you some other things, and so I'm going to get you straight. So I'm going to try to tell you what I think is going to happen when you look at just people who know the same things that I know. And they might tell the story a little differently, but be careful. Okay. Because most of the times when you read the local and regional architectural history, by concentrating on a few larger houses, note, of early settlement and local and regional architectural histories have frequently marginalized the more common houses of the early period. So this is obvious. The house on the hill are emphasized in your architecture books. These houses aren't so emphasized. You guys know that kind of thing right now. But that happens over and over again. So be careful about that when you look at an architectural review of Burlington's houses or something like that. I guess there's books like that. Say to yourself, they're concentrating on a certain level of income or something like that, most of the time. If you read architectural literature, this is a little into the weeds a little bit, but if you've looked at books about architecture, the development of houses through time, many books do that. In the Civil War period, there's these Italian, and then we have the late Victorian, and then we have, arts and craftsy, and it goes on. It's like a story. That's the way books are done in architecture and all that. Generally, you'll find that these houses, the Victorian houses with the turrets and the tower and all that, aren't they cool? Okay, and after a while they stopped building these houses, right? By about 1900, the Victorians houses, you get houses that I would say have an upper middle class over here. They still are informed by historical styles. And then in a 30-year period or something after that, we have the modernist period where houses become low, ranch house, think ranch house, okay? Cool architectural history? Oh, it's seamless, okay? Yeah, of course, Professor Hopper. This is the way, be careful. When we're looking at the houses, everyone's houses, what we notice is houses in 1900 that I've shown you. These are the houses that I've just showed, the small ones over here. In a 50-year period, the new houses of the general middle majority get bigger and finer and improved. It's that history that I'm telling you here. So be careful about that Victorian house stuff that's there. These are great houses, but they didn't get, the rich never left big houses. They just went into other kinds of houses and all that. We can't get into that. Okay, remember, this is the story that happens for most of you, for most of your families or something like that. Houses were improved in the lifetime of your great-grandparents or great whatever. So here's just houses get better and they get bigger. So the 3 or 4 room average becomes a 4 or 5 room average, becomes a 5 to 6 room average into the ranch house. That generally occurs throughout America. Maybe not your particular family, but on the total population averages, this occurs over time, and this is what is going on. Houses have not gotten bigger since 1970 or something like that. McMansions, you know the word McMansion, the big houses, 6,000 square feet or something like that. Well, anyway, there's not too many of those, but you can focus on them, but not here. So I'm going down the line, some things to be careful about, okay? But kit house. Anybody here not know what a kit house is? No, I don't know. If you don't know, it's fine, and all that. But some of you know what a kit house is, okay? This is Sears Roebuck. This is Chicago Record Company. This is Aladdin Homes. Okay, here comes the railway, that used to come into town over there. There's a boxcar, and every stick of that house, every hinge is in that boxcar. And you take it out, and you give it to your builder, and they assemble it. It's just like Christmas, right? Isn't that wonderful? That's what a kit house is. If you know that literature about kit houses, many of you do, and it's a guy thing too, because it's like I can put it together and all that. But maybe the owner can put it together. There are kit houses. There were Montgomery Wards and Sears and all that. They're cool, but. Okay, well, anyway, I asked so what percentage of houses built from 1900 to 1930 were kit houses? Sorry about that. That's when kit houses were built. Okay, that's when the Sears companies sold the majority of houses that you call kit houses. The ones that are in the railway car, they're shipped to Nebraska and they're put up or here or something like that. We got any kit houses in town that we're aware of?
Not that I know.
Yeah, it would be like bringing coals to Newcastle. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself over here. Less than 5% of houses built between 1900 to 1930 are kit houses. So if you've heard the story and all that, there's a kind of emphasis. A lot of scholars like myself, focus on kit houses because it's easy to study. You got to read the Sears catalog, and think you got it and all that. But the history of most houses, 95% of most houses, are a sloppy history of contractors who read a book and they ask an architect maybe or something like that, and they do 2 or 3 houses a year, and there's thousands of these, and that's a sloppy history. It's hard to tell. Wouldn't you rather tell the story of kit house? Anyway, be careful of kit houses. They're out there. It's a cool story, but it's a minority story. And the story of how houses get built is a whole lot more complex. And if you know builders, ask them where they get their ideas from. My twin brothers are builders, so it's difficult to talk to about things like that. There's a kind of magical quality of going to builders. So be careful about that. Owner-built houses. Vermonters, self-sufficient, pioneer Vermonters, building their own log cabin, right? All right, I'm cool. That happened and all that. But after a while, in your big building era that you have in 1900, what percentage of houses do you think are owner-built? Less than 5% of houses constructed since the late 1800s, or really after the Civil War, were owner-built. You see the concentration on owner-builder? I mean, in my Big House, Little House lecture, I always say, look, there's Jones's barn, and there's Farmer Jones. Did Jones build his barn? He may have helped. He may have helped mightily, but he didn't build his barn. He had a professional builder. Could have been a farmer down the road or something like that. We're not giving credit for it's fairly complex to build any building, and it got more complex. And so the idea of owner self-sufficiency and all that, although the magazines in the 30s and 40s, also in 1930s, started to talk about build your own home and all that, but it's rather rare. And 5% is the figure that I would say. So it means that 95% are not owner-builder, okay? It's done by spec. That's a kind of architect-builder term, speculation. Put up the house, put it for sale, and to unknown clients. I'm an architect. We can have an agreement about how houses are built, but then you come to me and I design your house and all that. But that's rare in American culture. Okay. Anyway, if you had to, I study builders and the process of how builders collect ideas. They're traditionalists. If a building works, they'll build it. Okay. They're not like me wanting to bust the design envelope or something like that, make something that looks like it's space age. They're pragmatic and all that. So anyway. How do you get new houses within tradition? It's an interesting problem. That's what most builders do. They work heavily within tradition and move the yardstick a little further each time, wherever they're going. Now going back to utilities, okay? Think about the 5 big ones, water, sewage, electric, gas, and telephone. Guess what? When you read the literature about them, what you'll usually find is most existing technological studies concentrate on early development and initial invention and the inventors in the houses of the upper classes. So if you look at Thomas Edison, electricity, okay, you guys, right? Don't you want to figure that out? Cool, okay, it's a good story, but it doesn't tell you how electricity got into most people's houses. And it wasn't Thomas, and Edison develops his electricity about 1880, the light bulb and all that. But it takes a while for that system to go in. Interestingly, as we'll talk maybe at the end or during questions, Hardwick gets its electricity quite early. And we'll talk about reasons about why that does that. But so be careful about looking at, there's nothing wrong with reading about Thomas Edison and the development of the light bulb. But if you're thinking about how your family got electricity, it's down the line. If you're on the farm or the Hardwick that's out there, forget it. You get electricity into the 1930s or 40s or something like that under government programs of stringing electric out there. Anyway, it's a long story. It's a difficult story to tell, even though we concentrate on the easier story to tell, the invention stories and all that. So it's a much harder story to tell about how utilities get socked into your house out in the country or wherever else you are. So here's a graph of how most people get utilities around America and all. And what I'm saying here is that during this period, between 1880 to 1900, a majority of Americans get water into their house. Even farm people, you know, there's pumps, there's hydraulic rams, there's windmills. Anyway, if you're on the farm, there's different ways that you get water, but it's usually later than people in the cities. But here's why I say 1900 to 1940. Most people get sewage, get gas, get electricity, and get telephone in this 1900 to 1940 period and all that. Here's early experimenters. You know, the rich, the wealthy usually get that, and then here's where most people acquire that. So the acquisition of major labor savings. So this is what utilities, but it's more pragmatic here. It's just saying, well, what does the utility do? Well, and here, so we have a couple of people who we know all the utilities for interesting reasons. Dwight Eisenhower, the family, he studied him, and people had. Eisenhower's a great president and all that. So, but here's the Eisenhower household in Abilene, Kansas. So here's what Ike grew up in and all that. And here the first house got a hot air furnace, and they got their first electric light in 1904, and they got a bungalow bathroom here in 1908 and all that. Do you see how? Anyway. Well, usually a wealthy family. They're upper middle class, the Eisenhowers and all that. But if I could just look at that and say to each of you, you know, you can do this. You know, now you know about your family, and what you'll find, you may not find the exact date about anything. Most families you can't find anything on, but you can figure out, you know, and there's stories in the family about when you got something, and this is family history. And you could say that little pink houses, there's hardly a history about families. Well, no, there is, but you got to work at it. And working at it this way changes a lot. And I'll just give you one slight, you know, it's an improvement that seems, you know, small, and that's the linoleum. Do you know what? It's an older material now, and all. We don't usually put on floors, but many old guys here and people understand what linoleum is on floors. It seems like a small item, but in your family history, the difference between having a linoleum in the kitchen floor and not having it is light years apart. I mean, think of mopping a farmhouse wooden floor, you know, with knots and stuff, and it's vermin. You can't get it clean. It's just, and then you put a layer of linoleum on that. You know, that's improvement. That raises the standard of cleanliness in almost unimaginable ways. I mean, we've bypassed it all. We don't have that kind of moment bypasses, but it was big time for the people who did it. And your family went through that. And it are those improvements that you can track that gives you a family history that I think is powerful. And you better believe your first washing machine was powerful for the women who washed clothes without washing machines in the before or after. This is life changing. Anyway, try to do this and on your family, and you'll get it, you know, very abstract and all that. Sometimes you won't get into anything, but then you can look at how other people have done that. So I'm preaching to the choir here, maybe, but go out there and do it. Every family has it. Like the big houses get studied because they have style or something like that, and a little house doesn't have style. Well, you all got plumbing, and then how'd you get it? You know, when did you get it? And life changes dramatically before and after that. Talk to a couple older people who've been through that. Like electrification that went to the farm around here in Vermont very late. You know, do some interviews about, you know, before and after or something like that. A farmer can now use milking machines. Anyway, electricity changes lives, and it did then.
You said we could research that.
Yes.
On our family homes.
Yeah.
Would that be in
No.
town records or utilities or?
Well, in your town, with Wiz's help here, you're going to find out there is a lot of local history. Now, you'll find that in the town meeting in 1897 to 98, sewage and water.
1891 and 92.
91 and 10, sorry. 1891, in a town meeting, they agreed to install pumped water and sewage. Okay, so there's that there. Now, the hard problem is, of course, who gets hooked up. Now, that sometimes drags on. There are some people who don't get hooked up until way late or something like that, but that's a start. Well, I'm not saying there's a lot of things you'll never find unless you record a history.
Talking about village utilities. utilities. You're not talking about rural
But,
springs and wells.
you get Professor Hupka on your farm, and I'll go through the cellar to see if I can find a cistern there, talk about how did you collect rainwater. I mean, there's a couple of kinds of things you go through about, what are the systems that brought water to, and how were they mechanicalized or something like that, and when. It's hard work. I mean, this is not going to fall apples off trees or anything like that, but you get a better idea of what might have happened. And ultimately, maybe you look at an equivalent family that we know something about that parallels your family, that is probably the order of that. And that's the best we can do about that, but that's not nothing. And that gives you, I think, a very sophisticated analysis of what your family went through or something like that. So, you get the little details that you try to expand. Things are different about, gas is interesting here because if you're on the farm, gas pipes, that didn't happen, and it still doesn't happen in rural areas. You get butane at some point, bottled gas. Okay, in American cities, gas is out there very early. Boston starts using gas for lighting in 1820 or something like that. 200 years ago or something like that. Wow. Okay, but it doesn't come into homes until quite late. So here's gas. You ever see old movies when the gas saloon with the gas lights or something like that? Isn't that cool? Or a dining room of wealthy families that has gas? That's cool, okay? You like that? Okay. The vast majority of households were never lighted with gas in any period. Most of you here would nod your head yes about that. Most working class families transitioned from kerosene and oil lamps to electricity. In other words, there were people who were hooked up with gas in cities, and some in countries that had gas production for various reasons. You have to get into that and all that. But by the time gas might have been put in there, electricity was invented, and then you never used gas lighting again. It just, gas lighting goes off the chart because electricity is like 50 times better than gas. But anyway, so here's a utility that the working class never had in many ways. And anyway, so it's a complex history, but you try to learn things like that. The toilet. Toilets change lives in many ways. Sanitation and cleanliness, it just increases dramatically, disease control and all that. And so here's the outhouse. Does your family have a picture of the outhouse? The answer is almost 99.9% no. Who would photograph the last remaining outhouse? Okay, there's that kind of a public embarrassment. Anyway, I look for these kinds of pictures and all that, but we don't do that because you don't want to be the last one. And there was someone, the last one on the road to get plumbing or something like that to do that. But anyway, there's history of that out there. There's a history of plumbing and how it's developed and all that. But for the working class, it spectacularly arrives in 1900, all assembled. The upper classes have experimented with toilets over hundreds of years. So, well, of course, they have servants to take out the night soil or something. Anyway, there's different ways of doing that. But anyway, working class develops that quite late. Houses are technologically advanced in their exterior, way ahead of the plumbing and all the things I'm talking about. So that here's a house in Milwaukee. It's a worker's cottage and all that. But look at that detail, la-dee-da. It's a Queen Anne filigree on top. This is technologically very advanced. Structurally, the balloon frame invented quite early, developed in New England, other places, and then siding and the production of wood. America leads the world in wood production with machinery that cuts wood and shapes it and all that. So that by 1900, houses that were built in 1900, this still exists, houses like this were built there, and they still exist. The shell was good and almost modern in some ways, but inside it's unimproved. So you can see that although the outside improved, the inside is relatively unimproved, and it's the improvements that I was talking about. Most improvement, now I'm talking about there's new houses, people move into a bungalow, and then they get, a full bathroom. But the usual process of improvement for the working class, and especially a working class without a lot of money, is improvement of existing houses incrementally. So houses that were built without plumbing get plumbing after a while. You may live in a house like that. That's the majority of Americans over the last 50 years lived in houses that instead of moving into a new house, they incrementally improved the houses that they moved into or something like that. That's American story. It's a harder story to tell, but that's America. So remodeling improvement, and in different areas you get different types of improvement that make sense to different people. So out in Oregon, here's what they call the pyramid. It happens in Victorian houses, but it happens in common houses out in the West, the Intermountain West over here. You get the new plumbing and the kitchen developed in a shed out the back. We call it Kitchen L here. I know they don't call it L out there, but we do over here. So there's classic ways that houses were improved, where bathrooms were placed in certain houses because they're put over the kitchen on the second floor, for example, because the plumbing can be used. And so anyway, that seems logical. Houses would have certain patterns that are repeated. Next. This is what I show in my big house, little house, back house, barn lecture and all that. Incremental development is part of the American way in some ways. So here is a common farm near Bridgeton, Maine, Sweden, Maine. So it starts this way, and it gets bigger and bigger and all that. And that's what happens. This is kind of dramatic that happens in a kind of New England farmhouse in many ways. But this is the incremental change that is happening all over the place. Many times it's inside. It's the bathroom that you don't see that's inserted in a bedroom closet or something like that. What I've been talking about is single-family housing because it's easier and we can conceptualize it easier and all that. But I could just as easily have talked about multifamily housing. And so I mentioned the double housing a little while back over here. But so I have found that overall throughout America, when people achieved their first bathroom, their first, electrical house, it was in houses that were multifamily. And the duplex is the classic one. About many of your houses in town with the side halls, they're easily converted to two-floor houses. But anyway, it's those houses that many Americans, or most Americans, I think, first achieved many of the improvements I'm talking about. There's a stigma sometimes about tenements and all that, but at the turn of the century, those multifamily housing they were plumbed. They had kitchens that had sinks in them and things like that, and they were built that way. Therefore, the multifamily housing sometimes led housing improvement in many parts of the country, and I don't particularly know your stance on that. We could talk about it if you want. I'm a fan, if you haven't discovered that, of the duplex. The duplex is a working class house. It means that two families are sharing the place somehow. Okay, usually an owner and not can rent out to two places and all that. But it's a sign of working class cooperative living. You got to work together. It isn't like standing alone and just being a fortress or something like that. There's something about. So here's duplexes. So 1/1 over here. This is in Portland, in Milwaukee. It's called a Polish flat. It's where you have a worker college and it's raised over, and you put a duplex on the bottom floor. So anyway, when we see two doorways like that, duplex. Cut it down the middle, one family, two family. So I don't know. For many of you, it's a surprise. Many of you can go past neighborhoods and all that, and there'll be a lot of duplexes, but they're not designed to be shown that we're a duplex. The doors are sometimes put because there's a cachet about having a house that is its own single house. It's a kind of class thing and all that. But the duplex led in many ways this story of improvement. The duplex is many forms, and you've got a couple of these forms. I've seen it in town, but here's America's most popular duplex, 1/1. Okay, it's one bungalow types over another. A bottom apartment, a top apartment, and over there. All of your side hall houses in town can be converted relatively easy to a duplex. Not every house can be converted, but these houses could. That's one of the reasons why they became important in many of your towns, like Portland, Maine, which I study. These side hall houses can be converted quite easily to duplex or triplex into the attic. You can have side by side. This is side-by-side duplex over there. I saw a couple, but anyway, you don't have too many of those. Front and back, this is in Chicago they have. This is not two, but the connected farms that you have, that's what you do. You rent out the back buildings some way. There's also, this is Polish flat. You dig it out the basement, you get apartments. Or you can have a separate, in the stable, or the garage. You make another apartment. Anyway, duplexes out there, big time, working class. That's where That's where life is lived for many people. Don't have time to talk about, but there's a story about larger apartment houses and all that. You have some larger. I wish we had a better word than tenement, apartment houses in town, larger wooden structures and all that, which have a history of, we call them boarding houses. You have a couple of houses that you call boarding houses. That's a history of houses that with multi-rooms. There's a history of boarding houses and common eating facilities, usually for a wife that is, a husband has died and they do a boarding house. They rent out their house to other kinds of people. A very typical income-producing development for working class women, particularly for income. So I'm at the end, and I just have a little story I'd like to share with you about a family in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is Homestead, Pennsylvania. This is a site of Carnegie Steel Company, and I went to school in Pittsburgh. My father played for the Steelers, so Pittsburgh is a dominant force in my life and all that. But anyway, outside of Pittsburgh is Homestead. And here's a photo. It's taken by Margaret Byington, a social historian who went around and just interviewed people at the turn of the century, workers in the steel mill, about how they lived and all that. And so here's a photograph that was taken by her photographer and all that. And I just show it to you, and I think it gives us a nice story about working class improvement over here. So what we see here is this living room. So there we have a 2-room house. So here's one room, and you can call this the all-purpose room. This is the bedroom, kitchen, dining room. It's everything, laundry room and all that. So the living room is what they're called in the literature. 1908, there's the Byington photo. So these are architectural drawings, but if you looked at this photo over here, this is the plan of that photo, if you look down on that. So here's the husband, steelworker, sitting on the bed, and here's the wife. And here's a pile of clothes over here. We'll talk about that in just a second. And so here's the stove, and here's the sink, and there's the door, ultimately to the outhouse that gets out there. So upstairs, so what we find out about this, these people over here, is that it's a 2-room house, and here's upstairs. And this is where 3 boarders live. These are guys maybe from Ukraine or Poland, and they come and live in the house over there. And she feeds them and washes their clothes. So here's her work, and he's going on to his 12-hour shift or something like that. And so we can look at that and say, well, it's a hard life. And it is a hard life and all that. We could talk about the hard life and the pile of clothes that she has to wash and all that. But along with that, take a look. What's that? Pram is the word that you want. Baby carriage. I never went out in a baby carriage like that. Anyway, this is a first-class baby carriage, baby. This is style and all that. And look at this furniture. Professor Hupke doesn't have that kind of nice furniture there. Here's a pendulum clock. Sheesh. Now we can focus on their hard life, or we could also say there's aspects here that are, you could focus on the wash tub or the boiling soup over here or something like that. Or you could say, it's a rare photo of what I would call a working class almost improvement. I don't know about this family. Like with most working class of this way, they disappear and there's no records or something like that. But what we have is because of this interview and all that, a very sophisticated, here's some framed art over there. This couple, God willing, that he doesn't die in a mill accident, which is kind of, typical and all that, or she doesn't die in childbirth, which is also pretty typical, they're going for my bungalow. What this stuff here shows is that this has this aspiration. What the working class doesn't do is write novels about, well, I feel that, I aspire. That's not working class and all that. There's a kind of grittiness about the determination. And I would say this is what this photo is about. There's a determination for the improvement that I'm talking about. This, I would say, is my relatives, or it's a story that represents what I know about my relatives in terms of their acquisition of life improvement and improving in the houses that I've been showing you. So thank you very much. Get out there and study your houses. Thank you. Questions?
Can you talk about water and central heating so pipes don't freeze? Did most houses that finally got water have some version of central heat first?
Yeah.
Or
Early efforts, they were conscious always about the freezing of pipes, so that they understood that. I have no literature on whether you can shut off things, for the three coldest months or something like that. I don't know of systems. Maybe there are some plumbers here who might have more idea about that. From my limited knowledge, I don't know about that, except they knew about that more than anyone. But it's a good question, and I'm zero about the protection. Insulation is rather thin at that time, packing with insulation behind the pipes or something like that. We have what's our date for the water pipe installation?
1891.
Right, 91, and sewer's fall next year.
92.
Yeah, 91. But that means that you did the bond issue. The issue was passed at the town meeting, right? Now, I don't know how much was done before 92, or then how long does it take? I mean, this is before trench diggers and all that. So the idea of putting sewage pipes in the ground and then who's connected and how, that's something that Wiz and I will get you informed about.
Well, the newspapers indicate that once they passed the bond to put in a water system, it went pretty quickly. Because in that water system, they included 14 fire hydrants, which says to me that it really was fire suppression was the driving force to incorporate the village and put in a water system. And as long as you're going to be putting in a water system, put in hydrants, that it all came as a package. I'm thinking, Brendan, that my house, which is 1840s or something like that, has exposed pipes on the inside. And they're on the inside walls. They're not out where they're going to freeze very quickly.
Yeah, it does mean you got to heat your house in the winter, and
Right.
they understood that, right? Okay.
When did the railroad come into Hardwick?
1872,
About late,
January 1st.
okay. And that would have been a real tipping point for all.
That was huge.
Yeah.
Everything that happened in the village of Hardwick for the next 40 years is directly related to the fact that Hardwick had a railroad. Woodbury has granite. Walden had a railroad but no granite. Woodbury has granite but no railroad. Hardwick had a railroad and granite, and that made all the difference.
But they had electricity before
And they had electricity.
to cut the granite.
That's a squirrely story, but they
Yeah.
tried electricity, and the village decided they liked having the streets lit. It goes back and forth, and I'm absolutely certain that there was a conversation between the developers of the granite at Woodbury Granite Company. By now, they had brought in some big guns with serious financing. That you get this electric system here in the village, and we will bring our cutting sheds to the village. You can't have steam-powered granite cutting material. It's not as strong as electricity. So with electricity and the newest electrical gizmos for working with granite, and gizmos is not what I'm good at. Paul Wood is the person to talk to about that. That the electricity was so much more powerful that they could work faster, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Electricity was a key thing, and it also spread throughout the village fairly quickly.
But did that come after the railroad?
Yes.
Yes, very much.
Right. Electricity is 1897.
Question?
Yeah, so you talked a lot about going from the unimproved house to the improved house, and it's just like, you talked about going from the unimproved house, which is just the carpenter, it's just wood, there's no technology in there. With the improved house, you mentioned your kind of 5 big improvements. Suddenly, that's a pretty complex undertaking.
Yes.
How did people transform the building industry to have, I guess, the need for new social organization of construction?
Chicken and egg here. It's a continuum of there's experimenters out there, often done by industry of a particular town, and what Wiz was saying, the presence of your industry here makes you lead. Industry is always in combination with the distribution, both for the industry and for that, and that's why towns with industry developed a little earlier. But you're asking a question of a very complex. I mean, look at your local builder today. You know, how in the heck does they develop know about the plumbing and the air conditioning, all that stuff? You build, you father to son. There's an incremental change and development that's going on. If you step and say, how they, in a flash, there's traditions of, of building, or traditions of electricians and all that all get together. You ask one of the more complex kind of questions you could possibly ask about how does it, does it move ahead?
So when's like the first GC appear? Like first person calling themselves a general contractor?
Be careful with the name. The contractor is a later kind of development. Builder goes back a little more, something like a master builder. So there's lots of vocabularies just all over the place. But owners call them one thing, and builders call themselves other things. So that's a nomenclature out there. But the key is tradition. About how the tradition is passed on and how it's acquired, and how that's what builders do. They acquire this. They can work with people like me, an architect, or forget about it. They can copy a house down the street or something like that. So ask yourself what the local traditions are that move things forward. Interview some local builders. They're tough to interview, though.
In 1900's census, there are men who call themselves carpenters. There are men who call themselves masons. In 1910. There are a couple of guys who are calling themselves contractors. I don't know where they came from, but clearly there's enough building going on that they need somebody who sort of manages a store.
Good point. Good point. And in Pennsylvania, they call them something else, or master builder in Germany, all that. So it's very complex.
I'm just curious about the waves of immigration that came, particularly in cities all over the East Coast and then moving west, and people of color moving from the South in the Great Migration. And where does that fit into the housing history, or is it kind of ignored? And that's just another segment of our history we really haven't been able to understand.
Well, I'll take the case of Milwaukee, which has a great income development of black immigration to Milwaukee in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, into the 60s. They come into the housing stock that's there. New immigrants don't build houses. So what they do is appropriate the houses that are there and convert or develop them. But they ultimately, the Irish in Portland, come in after the famine, they come into housing. But then local Irish builders start to develop by about 1890 or something like that, and they help their own constituency a little bit. The Hmong, after the blacks come into Milwaukee, and they use the bungalow house a little differently than the blacks or the previous Germans who built them. Many other researchers have said that they use the back door of the house. Think of it, the three-decker with the back porches or something like that. That's where they enter the house. Anyway, different groups slightly change or alter the existing condition of houses generally. There's weird people who do lots of weird things, but we're talking generally now. So, but immigrant groups usually don't change the culture of housing in any particular way. They absorb what's there. So you have to ask yourself, what did the Irish move into? What were the housing options that they filled? Usually subdivision of existing houses, easily, is the main route for most immigrant groups coming into a new area. Difficult question.
I have a question about cellars, if I may. I have a house that has 5 rooms in its cellar, and there are 8 or 9 foot ceilings in there. It's a big old brick house. I always wondered what on earth were they using this great finished space for? Was it food storage, or were there other activities that would happen in a cellar?
Yeah. Cellars are important. Cellars are a difficult question because it changes so radically in different areas. Plus, it's also, even within your individual area, there's different builders who build differently. And because of use, because of client needs, because there's bedrock and you can't do one kind of thing. So it's a complex area, but usually within a different town or section of your state, there are more cellars that are done with boulder construction and a little brick on top. I'm thinking of Portland now. They have more brick in Portland than you would have here or something like that. So there's more brick. But the usage of cellars, that's tricky and it kind of changes. Yes, I mean, everyone comes from the farm in some ways, ultimately, from Adam and Eve, I guess, or something. They were all farmers, going back. Storage of food is certainly there. Height is an interesting issue, and there's lots of areas of Maine, New Hampshire, and all that. They're lower. You got to duck your head a lot and all that. In Portland, it's 9 feet high. So there's local tradition involved in that, but that's a particular hard area because no one records that. Washing machines go into the cellar at some time in many of your lives. You might even remember the new washing machine gets located there or something like that. So there's a local tradition of how that happens. Very complex. I don't want to generalize about that in any way before knowing more about your cellars in Hardwick. But good luck, a very difficult subject. Well, thank you very much. You've been a group. Thank you.